The next few tutorials will cover how to extend Baserow with third-party programming tools, tools like Python and JavaScript, and no-code tools like N8End. Um, so in this example, this is actually a example that I created for a client, and I've just sort of created fake names here and populated with some fake data. But what this application does is it enables practitioners for this um, home rehabilitation business um, to see which practitioners are available in which locations. And they can search and sort and filter the data. So this is all things you've seen in previous tutorials. So if we want to look up a particular city, for example, we can see which therapist practitioners are available and what their availability is, what their certification is. And then there's an edit button here, and you can see if we have an address on file for them, we can see um, their address here, and we're calculating the driving distance. So let's say we want to go to, let's see, one Main Street in New York. I can type this, New York, New York. And let's see if we get an actual address. I don't know if that's true, an actual address. And so what's going to happen here is we're using a Python application, there we go, uh, to compute this distance from the origin that we've typed in to the destination that was on file in the database. So that used a series of APIs. So if you've never done any programming, this is likely not something that you're going to want to do right away. Um, we will cover more about how to do this with no code, but one way that this might be useful to you if you've never done any programming is you can hire a software developer to do these little API calls and just plop them in as iframes. So what we're doing here is you can see the home page has a data grid. We have a data source set to the local Baserow database. We have a table called flat. It was a flattened uh, import of a CSV file. So we've got all the data in here. This is all just fake names. We also have a users and an addresses uh, table, as well as a patients table. But what we're going to use here is this um, flattened table. So we have that as a data source on the home page, and we do have a link set up so that when the user clicks on the edit link, that goes to the edit row page and it passes the uh, ID of the row that we've selected. So similar to what you've seen from the very beginning with the to-do application and the form application. If you haven't seen those, you can go back to the first few tutorials in the series. So there's not a lot new here as far as base row goes. What is different is on this edit row page, we've got this form, and we can enter a address for which we want to calculate driving distance. So when that submit button is submitted, we want to navigate to this page we called distance iframe, and we're going to pass the ID parameter of the row, which we're editing here. And we're also going to pass this form data, the value that's entered into the patient address. And then on the distance iframe page, we've got just a basic layout. We still have a multi-page header with that, which has some links navigation. And then we have here an iframe. And this is the important part. So this functionality isn't possible with the base row system um, out of the box. But that's not a problem because we can pass the information that we want to get uh, distance calculations for to a third party application. And that application can be written in any programming language. And it can be created using any tool. We will use particularly N8N to do these sorts of things. But right now we're using a Python application. So if you take a look here, um, there's an address here for this URL, which populates the iframe. And it's at this address, baserow.anvil.app. And then there is an API called distance. That's a function that we're calling at that address. And we're passing the row ID that we have as a parameter passed to this page. And then we have this little origin set to the address that we've passed to this page. So we're going to call this, and what that's going to do is run an application at this address and return a nicely formatted layout created by Python. So this program is running over here. I'm using a Python framework called Anvil, and we're just creating an endpoint. So it's these 70 or so lines. And this endpoint, you can see, is called here. We've got this endpoint, and this application is running at this address, baserow.anvil.app at the API. And we have this little distance function. So if you're not a programmer, if you've never seen any code, you can get a programmer to do this sort of thing regularly. Just about anybody who does any sort of Python programming, or really anybody who does JavaScript programming or C# or Java or C++ or Ruby, anybody who does any web programming can likely create an API endpoint like this for you to take some data in and to either return some data or to display a nice output, which you can display in an iframe in Baserow. So very briefly, what this does is in Python, we have some information we're providing the application with the database credentials we need to access our Baserow application. So we're giving it an a table ID and some other information about the endpoint that we can reach our Baserow installation at. So for example, you've seen all these tutorial examples are at 101compute.com. And Baserow also has API endpoints, which it creates automatically for any database table that we create and any columns that we create in Baserow. Additionally, this application is going to call a third-party API, this geocode API, and we have an API key, a little access token that we use to access that service. We also have a Baserow API token that we create in Baserow. We put all that information together, and there are some functions here which get the row from Baserow that we're currently using, get the information, including the address that we've passed. And then we have a little function here that performs the geocoding, the distance calculation, using this API at a website called opencagedata.com, and it can compute the distances. And I pass it my API key and all the information that we want, get the latitude and longitude and so on. And then we have this endpoint, which takes in the row ID. It takes in the origin address, has a little default address here. And then it performs a bunch of work with that data that we've gotten from the Baserow installation. So from Baserow, there's not really much to do. You just pass the row ID and you pass the address you want, and this little endpoint is like a little black box that goes out and talks to another API and collects the information, and then passes all that back. And if there's an error anywhere, if there's no address passed, or if the practitioner doesn't have an address in that field, it'll give you a little notice there when it returns this information. Otherwise, it'll compute the distance and it'll format that nicely with a little bit of HTML and some styling and pass that back. You can see the origin and the distance in a header. It's all centered and it passes that back. If there's been some sort of error or exception, it passes that error back. So this is what we saw when we ran our code in the base row iframe. This URL calls that API, passes it the parameters that have passed to the page, and then this little API call returns nicely formatted HTML after doing all its computations, and that is displayed in this little box. So let's go back and we'll maybe try a different one here. Look for one you can see here, and in the Baserow database, I've got some checks for practitioners that have addresses, and in a real production environment, those would all be filled out. So let's do this, and we'll say one Center Street in New York, New York. 7. Okay, submit that. It's going to do some calculating. There's a lot going on behind the scenes here. We get a return from the API call, which in turn called the third-party API, which performs those calculations, the mapping API, which performs the calculations. So this is the basis of extending Baserow to be able to do basically anything that can't be done with the system on its own. And really, the limitations of what can be performed here are endless. We could do any sort of work with these external APIs, and those external APIs can be created with any sort of programming tool, any language, any sort of no-code programming tool, and we can just insert them in iframes wherever we need. They could appear, you could have for example, a little API that just puts out or a little application, could be a big application, could be anything that has an animation or performs any sort of work of any kind and connects to, for example, robotic machinery. You could send control codes this way. Any sort of application that you can dream of can be connected, and the results of any information you send to a third-party system using this API, this way of running an API and then placing the results in an iframe, can be added to any page. And of course, you could put those sorts of things in a header if you want to have an animation in your header. If you want to, do some sort of thing anywhere on a page, whether it's part of a multi-page header, or if it's in a footer, or if it's just to perform a calculation on a page, you can use this routine to do that. And the most important part of understanding how this works, whether you're going to do it yourself or if you're going to get a software developer to build you a little piece of application machinery that does something that you can't do immediately in Baserow, is that in your database, so we've got this database here. You can see I've got this little flat table. Got all the data here. Anything that is available in the Baserow database that you've created can be accessed using a REST API, which Baserow creates automatically. Typically in web development, that's one of the biggest portions of work that you need to do to be able to make the data accessible over the internet. But here, you're going to see you have a little selection by the database. You click View API Docs, and this is all automatically generated. And you're going to see here, you've got an ID for the database that we clicked on. And there are a lot of examples here that show you exactly what you need to type in as code to access anything in your database. So there are a ton of examples here, and basically everything that can be done with the database or even with the system, with the Baserow system, can be done using these API calls. And we'll cover this more about how to do this with no-code tools, but any programmer can look at this and understand if we want to get a row, this is the Python code that would be used to get a row, and this is a sample of what that's going to look like with your exact database. This documentation is actually created on the fly for your particular database, the columns um, and the tables that are in your system, and you can get these in JavaScript code, and you can get them in a standard format called curl that many systems can use, and you can also get a HTTP request. So all the most common ways that you're going to call this API, and you can see you can uh, look at fields, you can list fields, you can list rows, you can get a single row, you can create rows, update rows, and so on. And you can do that with every table, and is um, this is all documented for every piece of your database and the Baserow system. So we go back to the open database. There's one more thing you want to see here. Um, in our application, actually in our system settings, we're going to want to get the API key. So we can go into My Settings, and you can create as many database tokens as you want. So in these My Settings, click on Database Tokens, and you can create a new token. So you can see I've got a few here, and this is the map tutorial. And you can see I have got all of these set so that the API can create, read, update, and delete anything in these tables, but you can select that as you need. So you can choose that you want users only to be able to read, for example, or just update but not delete, or maybe just create. And that little API token, click these three dots and you can see it, or you can just copy it. You can also delete, rename, and generate a new token. That's going to go in your third-party code, in your Python or in your end-to-end code. That's what gets stored. I have it stored as a secret here in Anvil, but you could put that directly in your code. Um, and those are the credentials that you're going to need to get um, access from another programming language to your database. So you have this whole um, URL, you have the tables that you want to access. So I had a flat table and an addresses table that we were accessing with this code, and I was accessing the the Baserow database using this API token. And with those bits of information, you can query the Baserow database. So that's what we're doing in this Python code, and then we're additionally querying this third-party geocode API, which is out of the scope of this tutorial. But um, for anybody who creates web applications, um, and really any programmer who knows how to do some network programming or how to use a REST API, um, which is sort of a universal way of transporting data back and forth and performing calculations between systems, sharing information and sharing calculations between systems. That REST API is a standard way of working, and you have no code tools that can do it also. So that's just a quick sort of introduction about how we can extend Baserow. And in the coming tutorials, I'm going to demonstrate a lot more of examples of the REST API integrations, and we're going to do it also with some N8N no code integration. So you can see how to get your data out to, for example, Google Sheets, or if you need to, for example, send texts to a number of people using a texting service, or if you want to be able to send emails using your own server, basically anything you can imagine. Again, you can control hardware as long as you can wire that system up to work with a REST API. You can communicate back and forth between Baserow and your applications. So that may be a little bit confusing if you've never seen this sort of thing before, but you'll see it's actually much, much simpler than just about any other um, framework works to deal with web interactions. And it's one of the really fantastic pieces of Baserow because we get these APIs and the documentation all completed absolutely automatically. And that's typically a lot of work. And it's a very nice system because it provides access for any other system to access your the data in your Baserow database and do any sort of thing with it. Um, One final thing is that that API, again, the way you find the API is to click on your database and view the API docs. Um, but we have generative AI available, and this little application was actually created almost entirely using ChatGPT. So ChatGPT, Gemini, DeepSeek, any of the other Claude, any of the other LLMs that are intelligent enough to write code, generally know off the bat how to use Baserow, the Baserow API, and you can just say, I want to do this, and it'll walk you through and provide code to do the very thing you want to do. I'm using Anvil, Anvil.works, which is a Python framework. If you want to learn a little bit about how to use Python and Anvil, you can type into Google Learn Anvil, and you'll see my tutorial right here at the top. It's pythonanvil.com. And that's actually several hundred pages that explains how to do everything you could ever want to do in Python using the Python Anvil um, framework. Also, if you type in Learn Streamlit, um, there's another tutorial of mine you can find here at Streamlit Python right at the top. Um, and that shows you how to use another little framework that can output user interfaces nicely so you can create buttons and grids and put images and so on. Um, so those are some places to get started if you want to learn how to program a little bit more. The Anvil tutorial is really enough to get you going with just about any sort of programming. And you can integrate it really beautifully with Baserow. And it's a great system on its own. But for what we want to do, you just need to learn how to create some API output. And there are plenty of other frameworks that can do this. If you know anything about Flask or Fast API or Django in Python, or if you've used any other programming language like PHP or JavaScript or C Sharp, there are frameworks that can create these little APIs very quickly and easily. And if you need help, there are several million tutorials online that will explain how to create APIs like this. So we're going to explore this in much more detail. That's just a little tour of how everything works. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for the next one.